Welcome to You in the Law, a Chicago Bar Association production that provides information on various legal and policy matters of public interest. My name is Mike Alkaraki. I am a plaintiff's attorney at Leahy, Hoste, Alkaraki. That's plaintiff's personal injury, med-mal, and wrongful death. And I'm also an adjunct professor at Loyola University Chicago School of Law, which is my alma mater. And I serve on the Board of Governors there and on the CBA Board of Managers, because I am, of course, a CBA member. On this installment, we have two very special guests with us to discuss a very important topic. Aziz and Tom Ginsburg are, among many things, lawyers, professors at the University of Chicago, and scholars of U.S. and comparative constitutional law. In 2018, Professors Ginsburg and Huck co-published an article in the UCLA Law Review Law Journal titled "How to Lose a Constitutional Democracy." And they also published a related book, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy. And today we're going to explore some of the principles in those pieces and try to connect them a bit to some of what we're seeing currently. And before we do that, I'd like to ask each of our guests to provide a little bit more background. What I gave was so brief, I struggled to figure out what I should say, and I thought the best thing to do is just turn over to each of you to provide a little bit more background of what you bring to the table on these issues. Professor Ginsburg, why don't you start us?
Terrific. Yes, I've been teaching at the University of Chicago for 15 years. I've been interested in constitutional democracy for about twice that long, beginning with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And my research questions have been focusing on, where does constitutional democracy come from? How is it sustained? And recently, of course, together we've turned to the question of how it's eroded and can be protected and is resilient in times of crisis.
Thank you very much. Professor Huck.
I came to the University of Chicago about 14 years ago. Before that, I was a practicing lawyer. I worked for the Brennan Center for Justice, doing work on democratic institutions in the US and also civil liberties in the context of national security. I also worked overseas for an organization called the International Crisis Group. And across all of that work, one of the things that stood out was the importance of institutional design in determining whether people had fundamental rights that were realized or that were ignored or suppressed. Mm-hmm. And so that's been a theme that emerges out of work that I did, but that has been a very, very abstract thread that runs through a lot of the academic work that I've done since joining the law school at Chicago.
Sure. Thanks very much. Can you, and either of you can take it, can you tell us a little bit about how the project, the book, and the article came to be? I mean, obviously there's a lot of overlap in your fields of expertise and interest, but how did this come to be?
It's kind of interesting. We actually met in Afghanistan in roughly 2003 or so when we were both doing some work there. Mm-hmm. Working on the sort of construction of constitutional democracy, the protection of human rights. And then only a few years later did we become colleagues at Chicago. I think the impetus for this book was actually the election of Donald Trump in 2016, which of course came as a great surprise to many analysts. Although I think, looking in retrospect today, we can see the signs of that development were clearly present already. Mm-hmm. And what we decided to do is to take our angst, if you will, and to try to understand what were the forces that had been working on, led to this development, and that what constitutional design in particular could do. I'll just say one other thing about it, which is one of the themes of the book is against American exceptionalism. For too long, Americans have sort of pretended that we really are an island, that the forces that affect developments in the rest of the world don't affect us. And I think what we try to show is that's really not correct.
Right. The one piece that I would add to that is to put the work that we've done as legal scholars and lawyers in a broader context of work that's been done, particularly post-2016, on democratic quality and democratic backsliding. Mm-hmm. A great deal of that work has been done by political scientists and by sociologists. And the central questions that work addresses concern the broad social and economic forces that are putting pressure on democracy. A classic question in that literature now is it cultural change or is it economic stress that is placing democratic systems under pressure in ways that causes them to crack? What we wanted to do was to draw attention to the question of whether and how the particular ways our institutions, our elections, our judiciary, the structure of our parliaments, the allocation of authority between the legislature and the executive, all these questions that lawyers care about that occasionally bubble up into the public sphere, but are really in the wheelhouse of lawyers and not political scientists or sociologists. We wanted to draw attention to that set of institutional questions and the role that law itself plays in these processes of democratic backsliding. And I think even now today, the principal debates about democratic backsliding remain focused upon the very big picture questions of how has the global recession, how has migration flows changed the quality of democracy, and hasn't yet fully absorbed the question that how you design your elections, how you design your legislatures, how you design your courts, all of these things matter too.
Sure. Thanks very much. We can probably start with, very basic concept. Well, constitutional democracy. How do you define it or conceptualize it? That might be a good starting point.
Yeah, so we have a three-pronged definition. So first of all, any definition of democracy has to rely on elections in which the loser turns over power. Without that, you don't have democracy. Right. And that's kind of a political scientist's minimalist view. But what we point out that as lawyers is that you actually need a legal infrastructure under that. At very minimum, you need rights of freedom of expression, freedom of association, a right to vote, in order to actually make those elections meaningful. And then we really emphasize something which most analysts don't sort of ignore, which is the importance of what we call the bureaucratic rule of law for elections to function, for democracy to function. Obviously, you need people counting the votes in accordance with prior rules in a neutral way, or you can't have an election. But more deeply, we focus on the idea that in a democracy, you do need a kind of a civil service that is going to implement the policies that the politicians tell it to. Without that, if you could imagine an incoming president being able to fire every member of the U.S. federal government, every employee, well, then the stakes of elections become so high that no one's ever going to give up power.
Sure. From time to time, including in the last couple of weeks, there bubbles up some public discussion whether the U.S. is a democracy or a constitutional republic. Is that something that you recognize as a meaningful distinction at all? And if so, can you articulate that a little bit?
I think that distinction is being drawn particularly on the political right these days. Right. For example, Senator Mike Lee has, in hearings on judicial appointments, objected to people's description of the United States as a democracy. He said it's a republic. It's a claim that has been made in conservative legal conferences, such as the ones managed by the Federalist Society. Right. If one looks back to the founding era and one looks at the way that the words democracy and republican were employed in that era, there's no great distance between the terms. Right. Both of them were used to describe governments that were under some form of popular control. There were differences about the extent or the number of buffers that the public was separated from its rulers, from those who held political power by. But these were emphatically questions of detail rather than questions of principle. Mm-hmm. What's happened today is that this verbal distinction, this distinction in language, has taken on or has been assigned meanings that that the difference in terminology did not have in the 17 and 1800s, and it's become a way of making claims about fidelity to some sort of original understanding, paradoxically, in ways that flout the original understanding of those two terms.
So there's a lot there. Can you first talk just generally about threats to democracy and how you categorize them?
A useful way of thinking about the history of democracy over the past 150 years is by slicing it into two broad chunks. In the first chunk, which lasts until about the 1970s, the main threat to democracies, the main threat that we see manifesting around the world, is the threat of a military coup or some kind of executive-led coup d'etat. The classic example that many people will call to mind, of course, is the series of events that happens after the Reichstag fire in Germany in 1933, that most importantly turns upon Parliament, or the Reichstag's transfer of power effectively over all the tools of government to the Chancellor of the Reich, who was then Adolf Hitler. Right? That's the classic model of democracy failing up until about the 1930s. Up until the 1970s. In the 1970s, we see a shift. We see a shift from the coup as the most common mechanism for democratic failure to a world in which anti-democratic actors have found a set of tools through which they can unravel the force or the effect of democracy from within. They can use changes to the structure of legislatures, changes to the nature of elections, changes to the mechanisms of constitutional amendment in order to undermine the quality of democracy. So it's useful to think about democracy coming under different kinds of threat at different moments in time. I just add one thing to that, which is after we finished the book, or in the wake of the book, there have been there's been an increase in the number of military coups, particularly in Africa. And obviously we're seeing the fallout from one of those in the context of Sudan right now. And that's important to point out, because what we're showing, or what we're pointing to in the book, isn't some law of nature in the same way that Newton's laws were laws of nature. What we're pointing to is regularities, tendencies that we observe in the world, and there are always going to be exceptions to those tendencies.
Right. Okay. Can we talk about some pathways of constitutional retrogression, and perhaps some that we even see, to the extent they're happening, that are kind of people can relate to now? Do you have some examples that we could discuss, historical or present?
Yeah, certainly one is to, undermine the rule of law by either capturing the bureaucracy or capturing the courts in a very partisan way. That's something which I think, increasingly Americans have a perception that the courts are targets of actually political control, in contrast with the view we lawyers like to have, that the courts are just deciding according to law. Degrading the public sphere, the idea that there's fake news, the use of misinformation, the undermining of civil society, tax audits and things like this, which are used to undermine disfavored groups. And some things that we don't really think are much of a threat in the United States. Constitutional amendment is a very frequent thing which is used around the world, for example, to extend the term limit of a leader or to change their fundamental rules. That one at least we may be immune from, but I think many of the others we're actually quite vulnerable to in this country. And
I think we can always look back to the three principal elements that you describe as really founding the constitutional democracy, being free and fair elections, speech and association rights, and authority of legal institutions. And anytime you see some diminution in those things, whether it's censorship or the public not having confidence or trust, public institutions losing authority, we see a lot of that. I mean, we could pick so many examples, so I don't want to pick one. But we see what's going on with the Supreme Court and ethics issues, and just the discussion, without even taking any sides and getting into deep facts, relationships with, it feels like there's a lot of kind of investigative journalism going into this particular area right now across dimensions within the democracy.
I would offer some examples of particular ways in which those three elements of constitutional democracy is coming under strain, and I would point out that the examples that I'll give are all ways in which law is being used against democracy in certain ways. So the first element of democracy is constitutional democracy, is free and fair elections. And a major threat to free and fair elections is the use of partisan gerrymandering. And one of the cases that's currently before the Supreme Court, a case called Moore v. Harper, or turns upon a doctrine that is, I think, falsely labeled an original understanding of the Constitution that would have the effect of locking in partisan gerrymanders and making them immune from a whole slate of different solutions. So that's one attack. The second attack, free speech, we're seeing a really concerted push to eliminate libel laws, to eliminate the First Amendment protection that constrains the application of libel in ways that might make it much more difficult to criticize politicians. This has been playing out in Florida in really interesting ways recently, with the governor pushing for expanded liability for newspapers, and actually the legislature, with the support of the right wing, the right of center press, pushing back. But that's an example of that, of the law, again, being used as a pressure point there.
Sure.
And then very recently, with respect to the third point, the neutral bureaucracy, the Supreme Court recently granted review in a case that challenges what, at least for the last 40 years, has been a central part of the regime that protects the expertise and legitimacy of the federal administrative state. It's a doctrine called the Chevron doctrine that we don't want to get in the weeds on it, but it's a case that if that doctrine is taken away, there's at least a greater risk of politicization and a greater risk that the courts become, more than they are today, a venue in which politicized actors can do over regulatory policy that ideally should be resolved by experts trying to carry out the instructions of Congress.
Can we talk a little bit, because we're kind of deep into our time, we probably have about 5 or 6 minutes left. Can we talk about how to save a constitutional democracy, and one of the things that people should be aware of, and what community members and politicians and everyone who's in the mix, really everybody, can do to safeguard the constitutional protections in the democracy, especially as society becomes more complicated and there are more opportunities for authoritarianism, including technological innovations that are now just a part of our normal lives. And it seems like the more complicated and the more we have these technologies and other aspects, the more important it becomes to have a robust democracy.
So one thing, especially for this audience, is to emphasize the role of lawyers and bar associations. Right. That is, the rule of law can't work without lawyers and without robust defense of its principles by lawyers in the public sphere. So I really think that lawyers play a crucial role in articulating the value of the rule of law and in arguing cases to protect it, organizing associations to protect it. The other thing is, I think we really have to think about where free expression is right now in this country.
Okay, so the primacy of the First Amendment is obvious. It's repeated across dimensions how important that is. And one of the things that's come up, I suppose it's been in the news, or depending on your perspective, not in the news enough. There's wildly different opinions and thoughts on this, are the role of tech companies in particular. And the way they disseminate information, and the nature and degree of the relationship with the federal government. And one of the forums for this has been, Twitter and the so-called Twitter files. Frankly, I think it's fairly complex, and that's probably why a lot of, and it's also packed with a lot of important, ideas. And I think that people aren't necessarily sure how to think about that. And can you provide, what are your thoughts, and how should people approach those sorts of issues?
Let me just say I'm an ambivalent Twitter user. Don't follow me at Tom Ginsburg, but I do use it sometimes. And I think the Twitter files case opens up a whole set of issues for where our democracy is. How can we really have a public sphere that's owned by 3 or 4 individuals who can cut off candidates or people they don't like at will, where their algorithms, which we tend to think of as neutral, dictate what we see? It's really, not an ideal public sphere.
Right.
Now, the Twitter files case, I think, is rather interesting because, as I understand it, it was driven by the fact that you have this kind of chokehold on what stories could be shown, and a combination of the Twitter employees' sort of political leanings. There's nothing illegal about that, right? It's not violating the First Amendment if Twitter decides not to show Trump or Biden or something like that. They can do that. But the idea that this was being done sort of sub rosa and apparently with some contact from the government. It's not like the government was directing Twitter to do stuff, but there was contact.
There might be a little, I'm not sure, but it sounds like there might be a little controversy on that point.
Yeah.
I don't know, but yeah.
Right, but regardless, I think the extreme views of the story are probably wrong.
Right.
Yet we should still be disturbed,
Right.
because we are inhabiting a world in which a very small number of for-profit companies are dictating what's in the public sphere. I find it pretty worrying.
Yeah, it's definitely concerning. The role of the government, is maybe even a different story. But the simple fact of private control of such a communications device is obviously a big deal and can have a major impact on speech.
Well, I would frame it. I would build on it with a slightly different framing. I would start with the fact that through much of the 20th century, and this was certainly true through the era of broadcast news, we've had a public sphere that was under the control of a relatively small number of entities. It used to be a small number of broadcast channels, ABC, NBC, etc. Now it's a small number of tech companies. And both in that era and in this era, there is a question as to how to curate the boundaries of that public sphere and to determine what is placed in the center, what gets attention and what doesn't get attention. Mm-hmm. The first question is a question of what we would call today content moderation. The second question is a question of what we'd call recommender apps. What does YouTube show you?
Right.
And in thinking about who has that power, you cannot wish the fact of power away. Somebody has to have the power to do that. And the basic choice, or one way of thinking about the basic choice, is does the government have the power or do private companies have the power? Do you trust the government more or do you trust the private companies more?
Perennial tension.
And so when it's framed in those terms, this is not a particularly new problem.
Right.
We are really familiar with the idea that there are ample reasons to distrust concentrated commercial corporate power, either for antitrust type reasons or because we're concerned about companies that maximize profits while imposing negative spillover costs upon other people, right? That's a very familiar story from environmental regulation throughout the 20th century through torts. Mm-hmm. But we're also concerned about the incentives of government.
Right.
And I think that one thing that is brought to light in the Twitter files, but is not actually new or news, is that industry and government are tightly intertwined, and they've always been tightly intertwined. If you go back and look at lobbying by corporate actors, it's not like Facebook, Google, and Twitter are the first entities to seriously lobby Congress in order to ensure their immunity from liability under the Communications Decency Act. Corporate lobbying, the intertwining of government and corporations.
Well, we just got out of the pandemic, and however we feel about it, the pharmaceutical companies had a very special role.
Absolutely.
Yeah, including immunity.
And government policy is always going to be about building and expanding the economy. And a policy that's focused on expanding the economy when there are a few large companies that are generating substantial profits, there's always going to be entanglement between government and corporate actors. So I think the way to think about the problem is that the core dichotomy is between government control and corporate control. But that distinction, the state versus the private sector, always has to be complicated, always has to be resisted by some awareness of the entanglement and interaction between those two elements. And I think the question of how you, at that point, ensure the best kind of public sphere turns out to be, it turns out not to have any simple solution. It turns out not to be give control to the government, as Florida and Texas are trying to do, or give unfettered control to the companies. Right. We need to think much more creatively. And frankly, I don't think that either our leading political actors on the left or the right, or our leading academic actors have gotten past the simple dichotomy, the simple sort of, is it either the government or is it the private sector?
Right. Anything to add to that?
No, but I think a comparative perspective might be helpful when we look at how other countries handle it. Our political economy is, rather distinctive, very, very heavily reliant on the market. In other countries, from France to China, the government would play a larger role in trying to resolve this problem. I actually think some of the answers for some of the tech problems are going to end up coming from Europe, where you have European Union regulation that already affects our antitrust law, that already affects our privacy law. And they may actually, because they have serious regulatory capacity beyond what I think we see in the US Congress, might end up with coming up with some creative ideas for how to resolve these tensions.
I agree with everything that Tom just said, but what maybe one thing that I would add is I do think individuals can play a role in thinking about the way that they consume information and make judgments about both what's happening in the world and other people. I think that today we have a more and more of a responsibility as citizens to exercise discretion and judgment about the information that we're hearing and trying to really think about whether we're accepting and embracing that information because it fits our worldview, or whether we're asking whether the information is trustworthy, reliable, and verifiable. I think that that's a really important kind of litmus test that people implicitly are already applying, but they need to ask themselves which litmus test they're using. Yeah. I also think that the capacity of people to be able to talk to others who have different views,
right,
and
very
who
important.
are able to exercise sympathy and empathy for views that they don't agree with, and to recognize that there are very, very different ways of being in the world, very, very different lifestyles, very, very different sets of judgments, and not shut down lines of communication because of those differences. That's tremendously important.
Yeah, that's a good message. You have, and we're about done here, but I wanted to make sure I brought up, you have, I believe, a quote, a Tolstoy quote, to begin your saving constitutional democracy American style, I believe is the name of the chapter. And the quote is, everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself. Okay, I think that's profound, simple and profound, and everything in between. Why did you choose to include that quote to begin that chapter?
I think the idea is that you got to start with what you can control. And Aziz's point about consumption of information in our particular environment, where we're bombarded with information, and the misinformation problem is only going to get worse with AI. So having some sense of what you're doing, the importance of emotions. I think fear is a cancer for democracy, and hope is its lifeblood.
Right. Well, with that, I think we're about out of time. I sincerely appreciate you, Professors Ginsburg and Huck, coming and sharing your insights, your expertise, and really, I wish I go look these gentlemen up and see what they've been up to, because it adds. There's a lot of weight behind what they write and what they say, and we at the CBA are really thrilled that you were able to come and share some of your ideas with us. I think it's an important time to do this. And incidentally, I think we're on the heels of Law Week, so lawyers should be kind of engaged in that process anyway. And of course, thanks everybody for tuning in to this installment of the Chicago Bar Association's You and the Law. Thank you.